looked upon as maverick. This is usually a term of negativity to try to ostracize them in some way. So there are a lot of people writing, I would call them aficionados, who have taken up the cause and are publishing books on their own and through different means of publishing at the moment. And this is making a fairly big impression on the internet. So it may turn out that what are called Mavericks now and generations to come, hopefully, can at least be a counterweight to some of the scholarship. The scholarship, unfortunately, people in the field of studying these kind of documents, Gospels and other materials of that kind, often come from seminaries or rabbinical institutions. And very often where the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls were concerned, these were people who were under authority. So you really couldn't get an objective view or to go beyond a certain point from them. They could go this far and no further, but they couldn't see, for instance, if you said the scrolls are really what Christianity was in Palestine, they couldn't go that far. I'm somewhat of a pessimist. I feel that the authoritative documents are so authoritative in people's minds that even though new points of view come into play, it takes people maybe 30, 40 years of their life to develop these attitudes and points of view, and it's very difficult to pass it on to a new generation. So when young people or a new generation come up, they just start with the same documents that they had in the first place, and the same authoritative points of view hold sway. And I'm not sure if in 2100 or 2200, we won't be looking at the same allegiances that we're seeing now. We're speaking about the messianic movement in Palestine. I think that I coined that phrase maybe back in the mid 80s, the 1980s, because when we were looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, people were using the Dead Sea Scrolls to talk about Essenes. Occasionally they spoke about zealots. And this was terminology that was fairly normative, and it meant certain things to people. But when you looked at the scrolls themselves, they were more than that. And the idea of an Essene, as described, for instance, in the Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century, or his earlier contemporary Philo of Alexandria, also in the earlier 1st century, who spoke about Essenes. When you looked at these people, they were not talking about Essenes vis-a-vis any Messiah situation. But if you look at the Qumran is the word we use to describe Dead Sea Scrolls, because it's an easier jargon, it's where they were discovered. If you look at the Qumran documents, you'll see that they are full of messianic materials. They have all of the so-called messianic prophecies. They even have collections of messianic proof texts, promises, for instance, to the seed of David, and things like that. So things that we've come laterally after Christianity came into play in the Roman Empire and Christian documents took over the Western world view, prophecies that we became familiar with as sort of proof texts you find in these lists in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I began to call this the literature of the messianic movement in Palestine. And that's why I use that phrase, not Essene, not zealot, because I don't think they call themselves zealots. And we've never seen Essene used anywhere but Josephus and Philo. We don't even have it in the New Testament documents. So what were they calling themselves? And there are many names, but I think the whole literature is the literature of, because of these messianic quotes, the literature of the messianic movement in Palestine. The key prophecy that we're talking about when we're speaking about the messianic movement in Palestine is usually the star prophecy. It's from Numbers, I think it's Numbers 24. A star will rise from Jacob, a scepter to rule the world, etc., etc., etc. Often, for instance, in Christian iconography, you see the star over Bethlehem. If you go to the catacombs in Rome, you'll see Balaam, who's the prophet in Numbers, who is supposed to have first uttered this prophecy, pointing at the star in the actual catacombs. So the fundamental one was the star prophecy. Because of this star will rise out of Jacob, a scepter to rule the world. Now this is in Josephus. Josephus says that this was capable of the first century Jewish historian of multiple interpretations, and he, like rabbinic Judaism to follow him, represents, let's say, the Pharisee approach. He said he used the most cynical interpretation. He applied it to the rise of the Roman emperor in Palestine. The Roman emperor that destroyed the Jewish independent state in Palestine, that burned the temple and so on and so forth. He said he's the world ruler that would come out of Palestine. And therefore, he in return got the moniker Flavius Josephus, because the new emperors that came out of Palestine, the Roman generals, Vespasian and Titus and so on, the Arch of Titus in Rome is still extant. These people were called Flavians. So in return for his cynical interpretation and sycophantism, he becomes Flavius Josephus. But Christianity, for instance, has this star prophecy as applying to their picture of Jesus. And in the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the star prophecy is referred to in at least 3 extant documents. One we call the Damascus document, one we call the War Scroll, and in this list of messianic proof texts that I said. That's quite incredible to have 3. And Josephus at one moment in his Jewish war book says that the thing that most moved the Jews to revolt against Rome was the prophecy that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. So in other words, the war against Rome was a messianic war. So that's why I say that the scrolls are not only the literature of the messianic movement in Palestine, they're also the literature of the war against Rome. And you do have in this war scroll, it's in around, the scrolls are divided into columns because they're read from right to left and so on in the normal Hebrew way, because they're rolled on a scroll. So around column 11 or so in the war scroll, you have this prophecy, and then they interpret it. And they interpret it in terms of the Messiah, and they also interpret it in terms of the heavenly host coming on the clouds of heaven to rain judgment on all the world. Now, if you look in the New Testament, every time Jesus or John the Baptist or someone like that, in early church literature, James, the brother of Jesus, is questioned, they speak about, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, meaning with the heavenly host for whatever they're supposed to do, rain judgment on the earth. And so I say that here's the war scroll giving its Palestinian version of these ideas. And then in Christianity later, you have the reformulation as they're presented in the Gospels as we know them.
And would you say that the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for, the Palestinian star prophecy, could be called the Christ?
Well, can this Messiah be called the Christ? The Christ is a very ephemeral Greek terminology that very few people know what it actually meant. Christos in Greek can mean compassion. In some versions, I suppose it can mean anointed one. I've never seen how that actually works out, because this is very precise Greek transcription. But one thing is sure, the book of Acts, which describes the development of the church in its own somewhat tendentious manner, at least the first 15 chapters, speaks around 10, 11 or so on, that Christians were first called Christians in Paul's church in Antioch in northern Syria somewhere. There's a lot of discussion on which Antioch that is. I don't think we need to get into that here. It's very technical, but the head of the Seleucid Empire, which is where all these Antiochs were, or at least 4 or 5 of them, his father was named Antiochus or Antiochus. And so he named lots of cities after him. So the question is, which one are we talking about? Which Antioch is Paul's Antioch? But in any case, that means in the mid-50s, when this is supposed to be happening in the book of Acts, Christians were first called Christians in Antioch. That means they weren't called Christians in Palestine. That means in the 30s, 40s, or whatever, certainly probably up, because it would take quite a long time for that terminology then to permeate back into Palestine, if that's an accurate presentation. That means they weren't called Christians in Palestine until quite late, even probably until the war against Rome and thereafter. So what were they called? That's a Greek formulation. So I don't know if Christ is a perfect translation of Messiah, or whether Christians were ever called Christians in Palestine until much later. So we have to ask, what were they called? And I think they were called, well, messianists perhaps, but perhaps Ebionites. Ebion is the Hebrew word for poor, and the poor are mentioned in the War Scroll. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about themselves in terms of the poor. The James community was called the Ebionites, the poor. The letter of James addresses the poor. And so that may have been one of the names. There's one early church historian. His name's called Hippolytus. There's a manuscript that was found attributed to him in Mount Athos in the 19th century that was just recently found. We don't know if it was to him, but he has a version of the Jewish sects there, very much like Josephus, but slightly different than Josephus. And he speaks about there being 4 groups of Essenes, not one as in Josephus, but 4. And 2 of these groups he calls Zealot Essenes and Sicarii Essenes. Now, I think that's more like what the Dead Sea Scrolls were. That the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit Essene characteristics, Zealot characteristics, and messianic characteristics. And Sicarii was a word is found in the book of Acts 2. It's the Greek word for assassin or terrorist. And Josephus, who's writing in Greek, likes to call the extreme nationalist, partisan, zealot groups Sicarii, assassins. But they certainly didn't call themselves this. So that's a pejorative, again, being used. And so you have to say, who are the Sicarii? In Josephus, the Sicarii actually are the ones who commit suicide on Masada when the whole revolution against Rome fails. And in the New Testament, you have this odd character, who we have recently found a gospel in his name, called Judas Iscariot. And people, you just transpose the I and the S and you get Sicarios. And that's the closest thing that we have there to his name. So it's pretty clear to a lot of us that that's a parody of Judas the Zealot, Judas the Sicarii, etc. And then, of course, he's portrayed in the most negative way, except in the new gospel attributed to him, where there seems to be a somewhat reportrayal of him and so on. So I don't know when Christ or Christian came into play. It's very late. It's overseas. It's Greek. If it's a precise translation of something, I don't know. But in Palestine, these are the groups we have: the poor, the Ebionites, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Essene Zealots, the Zealot Essenes, the Sicarii Essenes, and so on and so forth. One last point I'd like to make on that particular subject. Josephus says the Essenes participated in the war against Rome. Now, in his description of Essenes, you wouldn't get any idea, because most people think of Essenes as retiring monastic sort of people. They weren't this, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were very active and not retiring, and they were aggressive and not self-effacing, and so on. Militant, I would say. So he said they didn't mind dying any kind of death. They withstood any kind of torture. In other words, they were the first martyrs, just like early Christianity says Christians were. They were the first martyrs, and they wouldn't they would not take the name, call any man Lord, or eat any forbidden things. Hippolytus says the same thing, except he's speaking about the Zealot Essenes or the Sicarii Essenes. And he says the same thing, that they would withstand any torture, go to their death, any kind of thing like that. But they would not eat things sacrificed to idols rather than for forbidden things. Well, if you look at early Christian literature and you look at the book of Acts again, Acts 15, where the so-called Jerusalem Council is taking place, the final rulings by James are abstain from things sacrificed to idols. Now, that is something James is portrayed as disseminating to the whole of early Christianity from his leadership in Jerusalem. Now, you look at Paul, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, he's heaping abuse on those people who abstain from things sacrificed to idols. He knows that eating and not eating, or prohibiting eating things sacrificed to idols, is a very important thing. And therefore, he starts arguing all through 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 about this stricture obviously from James, whom he opposes. And he says, oh, an idol is nothing in the world. You know, these people's consciences are weak. So because they have such weak consciences, you know, you're eating such things in front of them might cause them to stumble. I'm paraphrasing here. So when you're around them, don't do that, because you don't want to cause your brother to stumble. But as for me, later on in the same letter, he says, there are no forbidden things. Eat anything in the butcher shops. He also says some of these people in Romans, in the other letter, are so weak that they'll only eat vegetables. So this is how he talks about this. And it shows that things sacrificed to idols and not eating them, which Josephus says, or rather Josephus says, is what they were really not going to eat, is extremely important and kind of ties all these things together. Well, yes, the word Christ or Christians can refer to the Palestine Messianic movement, but it's a later term that has been used overseas in northern Syria. Acts, the book of Acts, that describes its version of the growth of what it calls the church, says Christians were first called Christians in Antioch in Syria. Now, that is not a revolutionary movement in Antioch in Syria. That's a Pauline church. They would be opposed basically to the Messianic movement in Palestine. They would be transforming it into something quite different, a pacifist, pro-Roman sort of Messianic movement that we're now all familiar with. So it isn't the same as the Messianic movement in Palestine. It's a later reformulation of the Messianic movement in Palestine. So yes, it can certainly originally referred to that, but that's not what it became, because the Pauline community in Antioch is very different from whatever could have been considered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the James community in Jerusalem, or anything like that.
So let's move on to why the Jews rebelled from Rome in 66 CE. Were there statues that were trying to be placed in the temples and they didn't believe in that?
Well, there was a revolt of the Jews ultimately in 66 CE or AD, depending on how you like to describe these dates. And as Josephus, the Jewish historian, puts it in the one revealing portion at the end of his book called The Jewish War, he says the thing that most moved the Jews' revolt against Rome was an obscure prophecy from among their writings that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. Well, we recognize that as what the Christian religion considers its Christ or Christianity founder to be. Josephus himself says in his own cynical way that they were mistaken about this, that it actually applied to the destroyer of the Jewish people in Palestine and the destroyer of the Jewish temple, the future Emperor Vespasian, and his son Titus, who everyone knows from the Arch of Titus in Rome, where is pictured all the prisoners and booty from the War of 66. Now, this war in 66 went on from 66 to 70 AD, and actually the final stages of it are also described in Josephus, in the Masada, which people have heard of, the Masada episode, which is a sort of a plateau or a one of those geographical features you see in Arizona and places, a sort of mesa, yeah, a mesa. Yeah, which is this Masada is really a sort of mesa of the kind you're familiar with in places like Arizona, on which was built a palace, a step palace, but also it had storage bins and things like that. And he pictures the zealots, but the most extreme wing of the zealots, one of the Jewish parties, he considers, Josephus that is, responsible for the war against Rome, the Sicarii. This is where the Sicarii retreat to. Sicarii is a Greek term. It's named after the knife, supposedly, that he says they carried under their vestments to assassinate their opponents. That's Josephus, who is already prejudiced because he's gone over to the Roman side. But that would be like the curved dagger Arabs even wear to this day. They maybe have used these in various ways, but I'm sure they didn't call themselves Sicarii. That's a pejorative. But on this Masada, they're the ones who commit suicide with all their families and children and everyone else, rather than surrender to Rome. So that's the last stage of the war against Rome, 73 AD. So this war against Rome is 66 to 70. The temple is destroyed. There's a lot of discussion who did it, but clearly the Romans did it, burned it in 70 AD, and then it continues out in the Dead Sea area at Masada. But I think there's some numerology here. That 66, if you look at it carefully, is 3.5 years after the death of James in 62. And I feel that the death of, in my work, I have described a sequentiality in these things, that you have these Sicarii or extreme zealots assassinating, collaborating priests. So for instance, the picture in the New Testament, the Gospels, of the high priests and so on, condemning Jesus with the Roman authorities, etc., doesn't show you that the people, the general populace, was against this establishment. It uses this as a way of blaming the Jews in some way for the death of their savior and so on. And it doesn't give you the picture of unrest and disaffection that existed in the general population. So the sequentiality is the assassination of one of these priests, the son of the priest pictured in the Gospels as taking part in the trial of Jesus. His name is Ananus, his name, and this one was called Jonathan. Then he's assassinated. Then there is retribution on the Sicarii, probably, I think, the stoning of James, which follows that. Then the fire in Rome, which follows that. And then Nero's using of the fire in Rome, supposedly in Christian history, to incriminate Christians, but which is actually incriminating these messianic zealot type people who are probably using the fire in Rome to answer the death of people like their leader, righteous people like James. And then this attempt by Nero to exacerbate the situation in Palestine and to force the Jews to revolt against Rome so he could suppress and destroy them. That's the sequentiality I see. So the 3.5 years after the death of James is the year 66, where the lower priesthood stops sacrifice on behalf of the Roman emperor in the temple, which is the signal for the uprising against Rome. And that's a popular uprising across the board, except for establishment collaborationist groups. Collaborationist groups meaning the Herodians, the Herod family put in power in Palestine by the Romans. The Sadducees, meaning the Romanizing and Herodian high priests, not the Dead Sea Scrolls or Jesus type of high priests, James type of high priest, and the Pharisees, who are pictured as ultimately their leader, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in the Talmud, is pictured as also, like Josephus, proclaiming Vespasian as a Messiah that would come out of Palestine to rule the world. And in return for that, not like Josephus, he wasn't made a Flavian. He was given a rabbinic academy in what's called Yavne to found rabbinic Judaism. So, but this 66 is a very important date. The fire in Rome. Proclaiming Vespasian as a Messiah that would come out of Palestine to rule the world. And in return for that, not like Josephus, he wasn't made a Flavian. He was given a rabbinic academy in what's called Yavne to found rabbinic Judaism. So, but this 66 is a very important date. The fire in Rome. We know there were areas. I'm being asked definitely whether this was caused by these extremist Jewish zealot type groups in Rome. You can't be sure who caused it. It's not clear, but they could have done it. Yes, it could have been a response, a sequential response, first to the assassination of the collaborating high priest in the 50s, then the stoning of James in the early 60s, then the fire in Rome, then following this, the Jewish revolt in Palestine.
Thank you. So, was Rome afraid of the messianic movement?
Rome was certainly afraid of this messianic movement, not only in Palestine, but elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. We know that these people went out into other parts of the Mediterranean world. We know there were areas in northern Syria, which is not necessarily totally under Roman control at this time. The Persians and the Romans are contesting that area. But also North Africa, we know that there's a church in Egypt. We know that there's unrest in Egypt. We know Cyrenaica. Luke in the book of Acts in the New Testament supposedly comes from Cyrenaica, Lucius of Cyrene, which is present-day Libya. We know that after the war against Rome, the extreme zealots called the Sicarii and Josephus moved down to Egypt. We know the Romans followed them there. We know that they burned this other temple that existed in Egypt at that time. They saw the temple and these groups as part of this unrest. We know there were other revolts in Cyrenaica that followed that. We know there were revolts in 115 that were put down in Egypt, and the Jewish community in Egypt was virtually wiped out. We know this from the papyrus trash heaps there. We know finally that there was the second Jewish revolt in 132 to 136 under Hadrian's period, which was more horrific than perhaps the one in 66 to 70, but there was no Josephus to catalog it in the way we have it cataloged in the earlier time in Josephus. So we don't know as much about it, but it was as devastating or more. So were the Romans afraid of this movement? Yes, the Romans were terribly afraid of this movement. Would they rather have it defanged, pacified, turned into something that was not as threatening? Yes, certainly they would have preferred such a thing. Was there a Roman secret service? Was there a Roman intelligence organization? Were there people in Rome who understood how these things were operating? I don't know, but there were very knowledgeable people in Rome. There were Herodian family members who were connected to the Roman establishment, both in Palestine and in Rome. There were the very famous philosopher Seneca, that was Nero's tutor. We have an apocryphal correspondence between Paul and Seneca. We have Paul meeting Seneca's brother in the book of Acts in Corinth, in Greece, a governor called Gallio. We know that Nero, was it Nero? Yes, forced Seneca to commit suicide at one point, and so on. We have people who are very knowledgeable. And so I don't know. It just seems to me that when Paul and Josephus ultimately go to Rome, they don't get free in any way unless they are turned, unless they become Roman instruments in some way. Josephus certainly becomes a Roman instrument after he goes to Rome in the 50s. He describes that he went to Rome on an appeal to Caesar. Paul also has an appeal to Caesar in the book of Acts. Something odd happens in Rome. We don't know what. He isn't seen maltreated according to Acts, and Acts leaves off before it tells us what happens to him. In some versions of things, there are characters very much like Paul that return to Palestine at some point in the early 60s and are sort of intermediaries. A character in Josephus called Saulus, who I make a lot of in my work, Saul, Saulus, Paul, and so on, who's an Herodian family member. I make a lot of him in my James, the brother of Jesus, in my New Testament code book. So people can read about that if they want. But yes, I think that there were people that were ready to work for Rome in these early movements. And the pacification of the messianic movement was very important to Rome. Last point on that. In Romans 13, Paul says, the ruling authorities were placed here by God's will. Therefore, it's God's will that they are here. You should obey God's will. You should obey the ruling authorities. Well, you couldn't get a more, of course, it's a letter to the Romans. You couldn't get a more pro-Roman statement than that. And he goes on to say, and actually, you should pay your taxes to these authorities. Now, the tax question was the burning question in Palestine, over which these revolutionary movements began 50, 60, 70 years before. He says, yes, you should pay your taxes, and the wearing of the sword will bring its own reward. And he bases this in the next phrases in Romans 13 on one of the favorite passages of these Dead Sea Scroll type, Jesus type, Messianic leader type statements. That is, because you should love your neighbor as yourself. You couldn't have a more cynical interpretation of the famous love your neighbor as yourself, what's called the righteousness commandment, as that includes paying your tax to Rome because they are your neighbors and you should love them as yourself. You couldn't get more cynical. But you see, I'm not a great supporter of Paul. He says some things that are really quite worrisome if you look at them carefully and not just as an awestruck person of faith.
Thank you. For our viewers, what would be the most important thing for them to know about the Herodian family?
A lot of people are not really familiar with the Herodian family. They see King Herod as great. We are calling him Herod the Great. They see King Herod as a Jewish king. This is preposterous. This shows how little historical information is actually being conveyed in the Gospels. Of course, we're not really dealing much with King Herod, except that all the members of the Herod family became called Herod, like all the members of the Caesar family, it became called Caesar in time. So it's very confusing to readers of the Gospels and the book of Acts who the Herod is that they're talking about. But the first Herod, the King Herod, the one who died around 4th century or the turn 4 BC, or the turn of the eras, he was an Idumean Arab. And it's quite clear from the genealogies and so on that his father was a priest of Apollo, or his grandfather, from the city of Ashkelon, Gaza area. Today, that's still called those names. and that he had been either taken prisoner or taken over to Petra, which is in the Arab Transjordan area as it is now, and his mother was from Petra, was Arab background. So this is not a born Jewish family in any way, shape, or form. I'm not hurting the Arabs. It's an Arab family. And how are they king of the Jews? How do they become Judean kings? Because when the Romans conquered Palestine, they were looking for people who were aiding and abetting them. And it turned out that Herod's father was one of the intermediaries who participated in the Roman conquest of Palestine under Caesar's opponent, Pompey, in 63 BC, when the temple was first stormed by Romans. So Herod's father was in that process of bringing Roman troops into Palestine, and as such, he became the first governor of Palestine. And Josephus describes that these people became Roman citizens in perpetuity, his whole family. So all Herodians were Roman citizens. There later on, the 3 or 4 generations later, you get Paul or Silas. He's got a Roman citizenship. How has he got a Roman citizenship? In my work, that doesn't prove it, but one of the aspects of his being from this family is that this is the reason he has a Roman citizenship. I'm sure Jesus didn't pull out a Roman citizenship. I'm sure James didn't pull out a Roman citizenship. I'm sure none of these people had Roman citizenships, only someone like Paul. He came from a very upper class family, probably of Herodian background. So who were the Herodians? They were a Greco-Arab family, somewhat possibly Judaized, though only Judaized when it was convenient to please the subjects they were given, who were put in power in Palestine and destroyed the previous Jewish ruling family, the Maccabean family, root and stalk, even though they used some of them to climb to power. So Josephus describes how Herod destroyed his grandfather-in-law, who he had married a Maccabean princess, Herod did. He destroyed her father. He had her executed. He had his own children by her executed. He had her brother executed. He killed everyone in the family and destroyed the Jewish Maccabean family, who were the Jewish heroes of the resistance that the Hanukkah celebration is presently celebrated after. So who were the Herodians in Palestine? They were a Roman puppet rulership in Palestine, and the Romans used them elsewhere. They were perfect Roman civil servants. They used them in Asia Minor. They used them in northern Syria. They put them in kingships in Armenia. They put them in lots of different places. They were what the Romans would call kings of the peoples. That is, in the East, the peoples were not part of the Roman Empire. They were little separate kingdoms. And often families like the Herodians were put in power, but these were people with total Roman allegiances. Actually, I had a professor when I was young at college who used to say poetry was truer than history. And I think basically he was right about that. It isn't what actually happened that really matters. It's what people believe happened. And the beliefs are in the old myths or in the old Greek legends or in the old Greek stories. Somewhat he was applying it to that, but it's also in things like the Christian and somewhat even in the Jewish Bible. It's what the myth, what the poetry says that matters, not what actually happened. So each new generation, whatever you say, is going to hear the myth, and that's what is true for them. And what follows is the actual history is much too complex for the average person to ever get their head around.
Speaking of which, is there any historical evidence of Jesus' life?
The question of Jesus' existence is a very difficult one. I mean, people have been arguing about it since Albert Schweitzer's time and before. It's known as the quest for the historical Jesus. The point is, something what I was just talking about, poetry being truer than history. The poetry is very powerful. People love elements of the story that they're presented with. It's something that they believe in, they care about, and they actually live their lives by it. The poetry for Christianity is in the Gospels, the four Gospels. In fact, if there's a competitive gospel, like the Gospel of Judas that recently surfaced, that's rejected outright by the down the line believers. So it's in the Gospels. The poetry is there. So I don't think that Jesus can be historically defended. I don't think there's any evidence that we can extend to that particular Jesus. I say to my students and other associates and friends that actually the best evidence for the existence of Jesus is the fact that he had a brother called James. Now, we can document pretty good a lot of things about James, because the material about James hasn't been mythologized to the same extent. It hasn't been overwritten with other people's ideas to the same extent. You know, in Islamic tradition, we have the Quran and so on, and then you have what's called the Hadith literature. That would be the poetry. Hadith is like news about the Prophet. Hadith means news, like gospel literature. A vast literature of almost a huge amount of things being put into the Prophet's mouth, some of which people say is authentic, a lot of which is inauthentic, people think. Western people. Muslims, of course, are like Orthodox Christians. They take it all as authentic. So the Gospels are like that, are like a Hadith literature. The question is, how much of that can you rely on? Well, let me give two passages that I think, show some of the character of this. Some of what we call the synoptic gospels, the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that more or less resemble each other, John being somewhat different in some aspects and historical development line. You have this passage where Jesus, I say is pictured because I think that's all it is, a picture, spits in people's eyes in order to cure them of blindness, or on their tongues or in their ears, or however it is, to cure them of being deaf and dumb or something like that. Now, look, those are the characteristics of Hellenistic, sort of literature, healer kind of, I think, mythological characters. I don't think any of us in the modern 21st century want our Messiah to be spitting on people's tongues in order to stop them from being tongue-tied or something, or spitting in their ears to stop them from being deaf and dumb. Those are the characteristics of Hellenistic literature. For instance, Jesus at one point in the same sequence, which is developing an attack on I think, Dead Sea Scrolls people. I could explain why, but I don't have time. But that same set of passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke develops into something where Jesus is presented in Mark as saying, he said these things declaring all foods clean. Now, declaring all foods clean is what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians, when he starts on the things sacrificed to idols and finally ends up with, for me, there is nothing unlawful, all things are lawful, eat all the food in the butcher shops. This is in the same passage where he's talking about not eating things sacrificed to idols. So these passages end up with Jesus saying, he said these things declaring all foods clean. But in the process, he says, or he's pictured as saying in these arguments with the so-called Pharisees and so on, you should actually not have to wash your hands before eating. He says this. He says this. Now, I don't think the historical Jesus ever said any such thing. Why is he saying this? Because it's an attack on Jewish Palestinian law of the Pauline type. So that is basically a would argue in this manner. And I don't think any of us now would say, oh, you shouldn't wash your hands before eating. So, those are things I wouldn't attribute to the historical Jesus. So what about the sayings in the Gospels? Can we rely on them? I'm not sure. I don't think we can. I think a lot of them have been affected by retrospective party strife, Pauline theology, and I think that as far as the presentation of the Jesus character, it's somewhat of a composite of many messianic leaders of the time. Many messianic leaders of the time, most or all of whom came to a bad end, usually by crucifixion, because crucifixion was the Roman punishment for seditious activity. Now, a lot of people don't realize that the Jews forbade crucifixion. It was in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's specifically condemned. It's specifically condemned as something that is an affront to God, that you cannot crucify people because you should not hang a man up alive. And that's in a document called the Nahum Commentary in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's a specific answer to those things in the Gospels, implying that the Jews either approved of crucifixion or were involved in crucifixion. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, the first evidence of which you see in the Spartacus uprising in the 80s BC period, when after Spartacus the gladiator led his gladiatorial followers in these terrible battles against Rome. When the Romans finally triumphed, they crucified people from all the way from Rome to Naples. And this is pictured by the Roman historians as a horrible. They left the bodies up there just to stink and rot for, until they decayed. What is it? It's a message to the people. This is what's going to happen to you if you raise your hand against the might of Rome. So yes, it's a Roman punishment, and it's one of the instances there where the Gospels really can't be relied on in terms of any Jewish participation in this. And I'm not trying to get the Jews out of this, but the point is this the historical Jesus? Yes. There are innumerable messianic contenders, leaders, others crucified. I would say up to the war against Rome, there are probably, and including the war against Rome, Josephus describes how he takes a few people down who were friends of his, the Romans were crucifying after they took Jerusalem. I would say there were literally hundreds of thousands of people crucified in Palestine from around 0 to about 70 AD and beyond. The only one we've ever heard of is this Jesus story. There are hundreds of thousands of revolutionary opponents and seditious people crucified in Roman Palestine, maybe 100,000 or so over that time span. And so the Jesus character, I think, yes, is a composite of many of these characters, but how much is historical? It's impossible to say, but there's very little contemporary testimony about this particular individual in this manner.
So what does the name Jesus mean?
Well, you see, the name Jesus is a Greekified transliteration of the Hebrew name Joshua, which in Hebrew is Yehoshua, which gets shortened in conversations to Yeshua, and then over into Greek becomes Jesus in Greek transliteration. Joshua literally does, and he's presented as a kind of being, does mean savior, he who saves. In the Joshua case, he who saves his people. In the Jesus case, he who saves the world. But it has a theological impact. Now, was there an actual Jesus person in Palestine? Well, there are lots of people with that name, but was there one crucified in this manner? Well, you will look in vain in Josephus, the contemporary historian, for such a presentation. There's one presentation that everyone considers to be a retrospective invention, in Josephus. But was there such a person crucified? We don't know. Now, was Jesus called Jesus? Well, if you know your Gospels well, you will see the fact that he has four brothers, and the four brothers come with Mary, the mother, and they're called James, Simon, Jude, and Joses. If you actually look at the Greek, Joses in the Greek, JSS, and Jesus, JSS, really is basically the same Greek name. So we know a lot about James. We get to know over the course of time in the native Hebrew literature, I'm not talking about the Gospels now, a lot about Simon. I think we know a lot about Jude. Not only Jude, the brother of James in the New Testament, but Judas Iscariot as presented in the New Testament and others by that name. But Joses, we don't know anything about any Joses. I think that Joses is actually Jesus, but it could be Joshua, Joses, Josiah. I don't know what it's based on. But the point is, as the Jesus picture develops over the first century and maybe into the second, people haven't agreed how old the Gospels actually are, that what happens is that fathers become uncles, brothers become cousins, and I think people like Jesus himself, or I don't know how to put it, turns into his own brother, or vice versa, his own brother turns into him. In other words, this is a way of distancing physical members of the messianic family, if you want to call it that, or messianic families like this, away from the supernatural Christ. The supernatural Christ is the basis of what Christianity becomes in overseas communities like the Pauline community in Antioch in northern Syria, where Christians were first called Christians according to Acts. The supernatural Christ is the basis, basically, of Paul's writings. Now, I don't think Jews ever believed in a supernatural Messiah as such. There are some indications of some supernatural aspects to the Messiah in the War Scroll. He says, because the War Scroll, when talking about the star prophecy, speaks about a prophecy about, and Assyria will fall by the hand of no mere man. And it goes on to talk about this no mere man. So there are some hints at that. But normally speaking, the Jews weren't talking about a supernatural being, and certainly not a godlike being. So as the supernatural Christ idea in the Greco-Hellenistic Roman world develops, the members of the family get pushed further and further away. And I think actually Jesus turns into his own brother. So I don't know what the physical Jesus was, and I don't know, I can't give you any information about his historical existence. But I have said that who and whatever James was, Jesus' alleged closest relative and successor, even in the Gospels and the New Testament and the book of Acts and the letters, so was Jesus. So I have in my work tried to do this, look for the historical James in order to find the historical Jesus. In other words, like in American history, do you think that Robert Kennedy was very different in his ideas from John Kennedy, or Edward Kennedy, very different, and so on? A little bit, but probably not totally opposite. They upheld the family tradition, whatever the first ones were, so the second and third tried to follow that. The same with this family. So if you can find the historical James, you can find the historical Jesus. But if you try to find him through the historical Paul, who admits to being the enemy of early Christianity in Palestine, to have persecuted early Christianity in Palestine, even to have put some to death, and is pictured in Acts as leading riots against early Christians, so-called Christians, in Palestine. If you try to find him in that literature, through the enemy, if you like, of early Christianity in Palestine's point of view, I think you can't find him. What you're finding in his literature, as he himself says, is someone he calls Christ Jesus. In his letters, he's the first one to use that term, Christ Jesus. And for him, Christ Jesus is a supernatural being. Christ Jesus is in heaven, and giving him personal, Christ Jesus is in heaven and giving him personal revelations. And he considers himself to have a personal contact with this supernatural Christ in heaven, who has appointed him an apostle, as he calls it, an apostle to the Gentiles. The beginning of Galatians, I, Paul, an apostle, not by men, i.e., not by the Jerusalem church, not by James, not carrying letters of appointment by James, but by Christ Jesus himself, that is direct appointment by the supernatural Christ, who he never saw, never encountered, and never met in his lifetime. So to my mind, a person of that kind is basically reflecting his own ideology when he speaks about these supernatural visions. And if you're looking for the historical Christ, you've got to look to these other people. So going back to the original point, who and whatever James was, so was Jesus. The Jews would have reacted to the portrayal of Jesus Christ in the gospel very, very, very negatively, as he's portrayed in the gospel, because he's basically Paulinized, talking about things like don't wash your hands before eating, things of that kind, or paying the tax to Rome, very, very unpopular. So we know the whole war against Rome was based on not paying the taxes to Rome and so on. So surely that person would have been a very unpopular person who spoke those things, but he wouldn't have been greeted in the messianic ways portrayed in the Gospels as popular among the masses if he had doctrines of that kind. Which is why I say, if you want to find the doctrines of the historical Jesus in Palestine, go to the historical James, who was very popular. We know this from early church literature. We know this from other documents, like one called the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, that pictures the popularity of James in his time in Palestine. That is a kind of opposition Acts, very different from Acts. By the way, we have a Peter in the Pseudo-Clementine. They're called Pseudo-Clementines because the church has said they're pseudo, false writings under the name of Clement, but they're no more false than any other document. It's just that doctrinally speaking, they're not acceptable. Anyway, we have a Peter in the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, who is a gentle Peter, an Essene type Peter, a Peter who wears threadbare clothes, a Peter who bathes every morning at dawn, just like the Essenes are portrayed as doing in Josephus and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a Peter who never utters anti-Semitic statements, as the Peter in Acts is continually pictured as doing, and a Peter who is a total follower of James, who is totally not only subordinate to James, but honors all of James's instructions.
Okay, now
these people, by the way, these people like Peter, or as pictured in the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions, not in the book of Acts, or someone like James were very popular in Palestine. And I believe the Essene Zealot movements were very popular in Palestine.
That was a good point. Now we get to a personal question. Can you describe your personal struggle in getting important information about the Dead Sea Scrolls to the public?
Well, the struggle over the freeing of the Dead Sea Scroll was the struggle over the freeing of the Dead Sea Scrolls was very difficult, only because of the entrenched positions that people had in different areas of the debate. I personally hadn't known that the scrolls were not all revealed until very late in my teaching career at California State University in Long Beach. It wasn't clear to me. It was only after speaking to several scholars of different kinds that I discovered that most of the materials of the scrolls hadn't yet been published or were even available to the public. So when I was a National Endowment for the Endowments Fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeology in Israel, Palestine, it was on the Jordanian, Jerusalem, East Jerusalem side, so it might have been called Palestine at that time. When I was a National Endowments for the Humanities researcher associate there, I had come to work on the community of James and the Dead Sea Scrolls community. And there was literally nothing I could do there because of the fact that the scrolls were unpublished. So that's when I began this campaign to try to open up all the scrolls so everyone could work on them and not just see them through the tendentious view of one set of scholars who had control of them, mostly under the authority of certain church members in Palestine, but some academic people at Harvard and other places like that.
Joe, of course, describes you as a very heroic figure in New Testament scholarship because of your work in getting that information out to the public.
Well, some people may consider what I was doing heroic. It was only heroic because of the defamation that occurred in the process of trying to do this. I mean, we were not doing anything wrong. We were just trying to open up these materials to public scrutiny, and so every scholar could approach them individually and not be under anyone's authority. And also, we wanted, in the old Chinese phraseology, let 1,000 voices sing. But the reaction and I consider, in fact, vitriolic defamation was so strong in some areas that it looked like we were being heroic in some manner. We certainly didn't feel heroic at the time, but in retrospect, some of the vindictiveness makes one feel that it was a somewhat courageous struggle. The scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls produced this vitriol among certain the academic community because people had their own scholarly reputations in their interpretations, and still the what we call scholarly cabals or scholarly consensuses have reformed. We've hardly dented them, frankly. People are still being taught the absolute same things about the scrolls as they were before they were.
All right, so it's basically done. It's like 3 minutes left, man. So that's actually good. We got that out. We're actually gonna go into some of his documentary. We ain't gotta pretty much say too much else. You know what I'm saying? That was actually good. If anybody that's gonna actually see this and pass time and pass due, give all praises to the Heavenly Father for sending great brothers like himself, no matter what nationality he is. Really, I'm actually really just now diving deep into his book, like as of now. You know what I'm saying? Like really diving deep into it. I always heard about him, you know what I'm saying? And I actually so I'm not gonna say like now. Actually, let me see. You know. Let's see. I mean, like I've been through it. You know, I've been through a few pages or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? Got some things, you heard me? You know, of course the poet first, but like I said, I did that was like literally when I think when Brother Yermiyah had sent me the book, because he sent me this. I didn't buy it. So all praise and shout outs to their brother. But I actually got this book from Brother Yermiyah, I want to say about last year. So yeah, we're gonna actually dive into it a little bit. You know what I'm saying? All praise before we open up with some little prayer. Actually, his book is actually good. It's actually breaks down everything. You know, you got some haters out there that made some other books off him and said that he ain't have to do all this. You know, you never take away from somebody's artwork. You know, if that's what the Most High placed on us, then because this brother can like literally like my scholarship concerning the renewed covenant and all that, and it's nothing compared to his. You know what I'm saying? And we talking like, you know, he been doing this since like 91, and that's when I was born. You feel what I'm saying? 91, and Brother Yermiyah said it, the other Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls that he sent me, he got 2 copies, I believe. I don't know, but I know that he had his since like 93. That was 2. You feel me? So shout outs to these brothers, but we're gonna dive into them. Let's open up with a little few prayers real fast. Our Father, Mother, who are above and within, hallowed be thy name of the twofold Trinity. wisdom, love, and equity. So on earth, give us, wisdom, love, and equity, the kingdom to all. Thy will be done as in heaven, so on earth. Give us day by day to partake of thy holy bread and the fruit of thy living vine. As thou dost forgive us of our trespass, and we forgive others who trespass against us, show upon us the goodness, that to others we may show the same. And the hour of temptation, deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory from ages of ages. Ages of ages. Hallelujah. Selah. Yeah. So we can share like it no matter what, you know what I'm saying? But let's go ahead and dive into it. It's actually a good book. We actually, we got to piggyback up off of it and show some scriptures just to even go to second and third witnesses. Everything that he's saying, which is, is official, for what I've seen. But we can do that, So let's get it in. So of course his book is called, James, the brother of Jesus, and y'all know exactly what the YouTube channel was called. You feel me? Yaakov Bishop TV. So like I said, a lot of this is gonna be based off of this, and a lot of Torah, because James was Torah. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, he wasn't down with the messianic movement. That was a Paul doctrine. You feel what I'm saying? All from a vision, but a story for another day as we go into it. So all praise. Let's actually get into it. But this is James, the brother of Jesus. It says the downplaying of James. The downplaying of James. Let me get rid of this. There we go. We're actually good to go. So here it is. Let me show it again. Let's actually get a little bigger. Yeah. James, the brother of Jesus. That's what it is. So we're gonna be coming up out of this a lot too. But like I say, this and mainly Torah. You know what I'm saying? But world gotta know. You feel me? World gotta know. So let's get it in. Forgive me for my nappy curls. All right, so it says the downplaying of James and Christian traditions. All right. Yeah, there we go. That's better. All right, the downplaying of James of all the characters of the period. The downplaying of James and Christian tradition. It says of all the characters of the period of Palestinian history, ending with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, one of the most underesteemed and certainly underestimated is James, the brother of Jesus. Okay. James has been systematically ignored by both Christian and Jewish scholars alike. The latter hardly even having been of him, his very existence being a source of embarrassment to them both. Muslims, too, have never heard of him, since their traditions were bequeathed to them by Christians and Jews. This is certainly very curious, because the key ideology of faith and works together associated with James in the New Testament. Scripture fairly shines through the Quran. Believe and do good works, as Muhammad repeatedly puts it, with an emphasis on doing. All right. It says, but in addition, Muslims' dietary law is also based on James' directive to overseas communities, as delineated in the book of Acts 15:20-29. The Arabs presumably compromising one such emerging overseas community. The silence surrounding James, though latterly breached by the finds in the Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, and the author's theories about the Dead Sea Scrolls, was not accidental. The early church theologian and historian Eusebius, 260-340, books we read about all praises, finalized the process of the downplaying of James. He was the bishop of Caesarea in Palestine and participated in the Constantine's reorganization of the empire following his conversation. Though Eusebius acknowledged the New Testament letter of James, though Jude, to be in general pastoral use, he nevertheless questions its authenticity, presumably because its content and theological approach were so alien to him. Augustine, which is another church historian, says, writing to his older contemporary, Jerome, 348-420, expressed his concern about problems between Peter and Paul, signaled in Paul's letter to Galatians. Clearly, these were directly connected to James, leadership in the early church and his directives. All praise. Then it says, curiously, it says neither Augustine nor Jerome mentions James in his exchange at all. All right. Neither Augustine nor Jerome mentions James in his exchange at all. And I actually believe this is true because I ordered, let me show y'all. I'm gonna actually show it because I don't read it. This is why I don't read it. You're not lying. This is why I don't read it. I was put under the impression that that one of the early Christian writers, Jerome, actually talked about it, and he didn't. And I'm gonna show y'all real fast. And I'm glad he pointed that out because I thought I was tripping. Excuse me, hold on. Excuse me, y'all. But here it is right here. Show y'all, man. This is crazy. And I'm glad he's second witnesses, man. So don't buy this book, man. If you ever get into the Christian, the trying to find the Essene doctrine, like, this is real disappointing. I'm gonna keep it. I wish I can actually sell it back. Oh, this Eusebius. That's why. My bad. I picked up the wrong book. My bad. So this is Jerome. Sorry about that. This is Jerome. You see it, Jerome. All right. So when you look at the everything, it won't say nothing about James. You hear me? It won't say nothing about James. Nothing. You won't see a James in nowhere. But like when you look at the other books I do got, which I'm not going to just do that, but you know, you will see various James this, James that, Simon this, Simon that, his brothers and all that. You know what I'm saying? You won't see nothing about James in this vortex. So, but yeah, so don't buy that book. But let's keep going. It says neither Augustine nor Jerome mentions James in this exchange at all. All right. It says Martin Luther 1,000 years later felt that the letter of James should not have been included in the New Testament at all. I wonder why. You know why? Because Christianity would never made it as far as it did today. All right. And it says what? It says, it is not surprising that these arbiters of Christian opinions and there should have felt the way that they did, because it is hard to consider the letter of James as Christian at all. If we take as our yardstick the Gospels in their present form of Paul's letters, if we widen this interpretation somewhat to include the Eastern sectarian tendency referred to in early church literature as Ebionite, all right, deriving from the original Hebrew word meaning the poor, and other parallel current producing additional variations related to it, like the Essenes, Nazarenes, all right. It says that, what it say, the Elkosites and the Mannequins. Even in Islam, we discover a different story, for it is part that the letter of James, in its essence, resembled nothing so much as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Which is why, prior to their discovery, it may have been difficult to appreciate it. Origen, 185 to 254, which is another Christian writer historian. It says, who had also spent time in Caesarea on the Palestine coast, railed against traditions he knew giving James more prominence. Then he was prepared to accord him, namely those connecting James' death to the fall of Jerusalem. Okay. The normal scriptural view and popular theology to this day connects Yeshua's death to James. Okay. Listen to that again. The normal scriptural view and popular theology to this day connects Yeshua's death to James, to the destruction of the temple. This is not only associated with the little apocalypses, but echoed in the famous gospel assertion attributed to Jesus. I shall raise it up in 3 days. John chapter 2:19. We know that scripture. All right. And it says, Yeshua is, all right. It said, Yeshua is ostensibly presented as referring to the temple, but John is most anxious to clarify this, adding, he was speaking about the temple of anxious to clarify this, adding, it says he was speaking about the temple of his body. Though Origen was later accused of heresy, his view of the tradition connecting to the fall of Jerusalem to the death of James, which he credited to Josephus, is probably not a little connected with its disappearance from these materials as they have come down to us. Pay attention. It says Eusebius. No, am I right there? Yeah. Eusebius contemptuously alluded to the poverty-stricken spirituality of the Ebionites, holding James' name in such high esteem. He did so in the form of a pun on the Hebrew meaning of their name, the poor, thereby showing himself very knowledgeable about the meaning and implications of biblical references involving this usage. So basic for a consideration of James' person. It says the euphemism, the poor, was already in common use, an honorable form of self-designation in the community responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, commonly called the Qumran community because of the location of the caves along the Dead Sea where the scrolls were found, called in Arabic Wadi or Karabek Qumran, as it is among. All right, next page 5 for following. All right, those in contact with James, Jerusalem community, most notably Paul. The usage also figures prominently in both the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospel of Matthew, and in the letter attributed to the James himself. The group or movement associated with James' name and teaching in Jerusalem is usually referred to as the Jerusalem church or community, an English approximation for the Greek word ecclesia, all right, which literally means assembly. It is also possibly to refer to as the Palestinian Christianity, which indeed be appropriate, but an even more popular notation one finds in the literature in Jewish Christianity. Next sec, it says Jewish and Christian sectarianism. It says sects such as these were at a very clearly time pronounced anathema by the rabbis, the hearers of the Pharisees, pictured in the New Testament, who took over Judaism by default 7.5 years after James' judicial murder. After the destruction of the temple, there was the only Jewish tradition, the only Jewish tradition the Romans were willing to tolerate in Palestine. The legal tradition they inherited has come to be known as halakha, the sum total religious law according to the traditions of the Pharisees. It is preserved in the literature of the rabbis, known as the Talmud. This includes what is also known as the oral law and consists mainly of a document compiled in the 3rd century called the Mishnah, a number of the commentaries on it, and further traditional compilations together known as either the Babylonian or Jerusalem Talmud, depending on whether they originated in Iraq or Palestine. The movement headed by James, all right? The movement headed by James from the 40s to the 60s CE in Jerusalem was the principal one of a number of groups categorized in the Talmud by the pejorative terminology men or minim, plural. This has now to mean in Jewish tradition sectarian, with the gradual production of the rabbinical literature at the time of Yeshua, or the sectarian leaders who went under the title rabbi as well. A new form of Judaism was formulated, no longer predicted on the temple. This became dominant in Palestine only after the Roman imposed it by brute force because of its palpably more accommodating attitude towards foreign rule, and at least while the temple was still standing to high priests appointed by foreigners or foreign controlled rulers, it was really the only form of Jewish religious expression the Romans were willing to live with. The same was true for the form of Christianity we can refer. Next page. All right. To the Pauline, which was equally submissive or accommodating to Roman power. For this Paul proudly proclaimed his Pharisaic roots in Philippians chapter 3 and 5. Let's look at that. I think this is when he said he was a Pharisee, but we can look at that. Share screen. Yeah. Let me see. All right. So we start at 4. It say, thought I might also have confidence in the flesh. If any other man thinketh that he whereof, he must trust in the flesh. I more. Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law of Pharisee. All right. So there it is. Like Robert Eisenman saying in his book was just letting us know how Paul was just letting us refer back to his Hebrew roots, you know, or so forth. Okay. He'll probably hear me on this thing for sure. I think he is. I don't know. He said all praise. Let's keep going. Then it also goes on to say that this form of Judaism must be distinguished from the more variegated tapestry that characterized Jewish religious expressions in Yeshua and James' lifetimes. This consisted of quite a number of groups before the fall of the temple, some of which were quite militant and aggressive, even apocalyptic. That is, having a concern for a highly emotive style, of expression regarding the end time. Most of these apocalyptic groups focused in one way or another on the temple. They were written out of Judaism in the same manner that James and Yeshua. Other brothers were written out of Christianity. Christianity, as we know it, developed in the West in all contradictions to the more variegated landscape that continued to characterize the East. It would be more proper to refer to the Western Christianity at this point as Pauline or Gentile Christianity. See that? It came to be seen as orthodox largely as a result of the efforts of Eusebius and like-minded persons who put the reorganization program ascribed to Constantine into effect. It can also be usually referred to as the overseas or Hellenistic Christianity as opposed to Palestinian Christianity. Its documents and credos were collected and imposed on what is now known as the Christian world at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, and others that followed in the 4th century and beyond. These formally asserted the divinity of Jesus and made it orthodox. Eusebius, who came from Caesarea Palestine, was Constantine's bishop and personal confidant. Confidant. See that? So that's what we was talking about when I showed you the Eusebius book. All right. So he just lets us know that he was one of the companions of who? Of Constantine. Okay. And this is why he knows so much about all the sects, especially the Essenes and Ebionites, which he wrote so much about his book. You feel me? You got to know your enemy. And of course, so let's keep going. So it says the development of the genre of overseas Christianity was actually, I think I skipped one. He said he had a major role in the organization and guidance of the Council of Nicaea. There it is. The development of the genre of overseas Christianity was actually concurrent and parallel to the development of the rabbinic Judaism, if something of its mirror image. Both were not only willing to live with Roman power, they owed their continued existence to its sponsorship. To put this proposition differently, the fact of the power and brutality of Rome was operating in both to drive out and to declare heretical what is now called Jewish Christianity, Essenism, or Ebionitism. There it is. Let's read that again. He says, to put the proposition differently, the fact of the power and brutality of Rome was operating in both to drive out and to declare heretical what is now called Jewish Christianity, Essenism, or Ebionitism, would perhaps be a better description of in Palestine, in Judaism. What was left perhaps be a better, what was left, all right, was a legalistic shadow of former glories, bereft of apocalyptic and messianic tendencies in Christianity, a largely Hellenized, otherworldly mystery cult, the real religious legacy of 300 years of Roman religious genius and assimilation. You feel that what it's saying? So that's all he letting that's all this is that he letting you know. All right, is that we've all been Hellenized. Okay, just like you had Hellenized Jews back in the New Testament, we've been Hellenized now from these same documents from the New Testament of this character they call Jesus Christ, whom Paul made up as far as his divinity, saying that he was from a virgin birth and that he was this divine figure coming back to save the world and all that, opposed to how the real followers of Yeshua viewed him as a just man. You feel what I'm saying? And this is what's going on here. These is facts, okay? You had different sects in those times, and that's what a lot of people fail to realize, like we spoke about in the past. You know, if you were in those days, what sect would you belong to? Would you be an Essene, a Nazarene, a Pharisee, a Sadducee? And that's what people have to realize. So what sect would you be a part of? We know what sect we will be a part of, the Ebionites, the Essenes, okay? And our brothers who believe in the Messianic movement will be part of the Nazarenes. And our brothers that standing on the corners yelling at Esau's, those would be like the Pharisees. You feel what I'm saying? Or so-called Sadducees. Some of them are Sadducees also, because they all them two also, you know, different. They did have, I forgot, we'll get into that later, but as far as they had different beliefs on some. One was like the resurrection, and I forgot what the other one was. But again, you know, so this what it is, and this what we follow. And then, like, again, our Christian people will be people like you know, you got Hebrew Christians too, but our Christians will be the Constantines, the Council of Nicaeas. You feel me? The Pauline Christianities. I'm just putting people into real categories of their beliefs according to this book. So that's just what it'll be. You know what I'm saying? That's what it is. So, and it says, would perhaps be a better description or of it in Palestine. In Judaism, what was left was a legalistic shadow of former glories. All right. Birth of apocalyptic and messianic tendencies in Christianity, a largely Hellenized, otherworldly mystery cult. You heard me? All right. The real religious legacy of 300 years of Roman religious, and assimilation. I had 8 before I started, excuse me. This surgery was necessary if Christianity in the form we know it was to survive, represented by James, all right, the brother of Jesus. And it goes on to say, and probably dating back to the Messianic predecessor Jesus, were distinctly opposed to those ultimately considered to be Christian. All right, here it is. James, the real successor of Yeshua, not Peter. There it is. See that? And that's what a lot of Christians fail to realize. I actually want to show that. That's what a lot of Christians fail to realize. Let's see if I can show that. Yeah. That way. Yeah. Real talk. I don't know how good it show, but that's what it say. You know, James, the real successor to Jesus and not Peter. And that's what the world think. You know, I even thought that at one point till I got to read, like, damn. And even when you get to read, like I say, even Simon was the last. Simon was either the brother, all right, according to the Gospels, or a cousin of Yeshua. I believe it was his brother, but the last relative of Yeshua, who was the successor of James. All right, but even when you look through history, if you see, Peter never became a bishop. Peter never became a bishop, and he never returned back to Jerusalem with the elders. All right, because again, James wanted to put him up under a 6-year probation period, and he wasn't going. So he stayed his butt in Rome and Antioch. You feel me? All right. So it says, in the literature, James placed as successor to an inheritor of the mantle of his brother was largely taken over by the more or less mythology, presentation of the claims of an individual known in the West as Peter or the Rock. All right, the Rock. And I think this is what a lot of people go off right here. I'm going to show it real quick. Let's see. There it is. So it's in Matthew 16 and 18. Yeah, I think he's saying Matthew 16 and 18. All right, there it is. So that's what a lot of people like to read right there. And I say unto thee, that thou, Peter, and upon this rock I should build my church, and the gates of hell should not prevail against it. All right. So according to Matthew chapter 16 and 18, this is why a lot of people like to think that Peter was the successor of Jesus after he died on the cross, or whomever that people like to call him. You know what I'm saying? Yeshua, the Christ Messiah. Yeah, but a lot of people, include myself, thought according to Matthew 16 and 18, after Christ, or whom some call Yeshua, or Yeshua, whom some call Christ, Peter was the successor, and which it was not. It was James, and we can look that up in Acts 15, and we know it. All praises. So let's keep going. And then it says that this was logical. All right. This was a logical end of the legitimization of certain claims advanced by the now Hellenized and largely non-Jewish Gentile church at Rome, following the destruction of Jerusalem Center and the wake of the uprising against Rome. It is an interesting coincidence that the Jerusalem community of James the Just and the community at Qumran disappear about the same time, though perhaps this is not so coincidental as it may seem. This rock terminology reflected in James' name and the imagery related to it were actually in use contemporaneously in Palestine and both the literature at Qumran and what were probably the documents in Jerusalem church. And the latter, a version of it was applied to James, all right, as well probably as to his successor, a man identified in the tradition as Jesus, and therefore James' first cousin, Simeon bar Cleophas, all right, or Simon bar Cleophas, what I've been reading. It says Simon's father Cleophas, depending on the degree of confusion, is usually seen as the brother or brother-in-law of Joseph. This name resonates in the interesting ways with the version of Simon Peter's name, Cephas, encountered in Galatians chapter 1, Corinthians, and the Gospel of John, Acts chapter 15 and 14. At the famous Jerusalem Council actually refers to Peter as Simeon, at a time when Peter had already supposedly fled Palestine on pain of death. We shall see that Simeon, bar Cleophas, is very likely the second brother of Jesus, Simon, as presented in the gospel manner of an Islamic caliphate and Shiite, one of that is one censored of the family of Jesus. See what I'm saying? And that's what we was reading earlier in Matthew chapter 13. You know what I'm saying? I believe I had put that down there. I believe it's Matthew 13 and 55, which lets me know, like it said, is this not the carpenter's son? You know, is this not the carpenter's son? I was on the jumped already up. Yes, is this not the carpenter's son? It's not his mother called Mary and his brother James, Joses, Simon, and Judas. Okay, there we go. Like the brother said, Robin Eisenman, some brothers become cousins, cousins become brothers, mothers become sisters, sisters become mothers, husbands become, whatever. But that's how they do it in the scripture, just to cover up a few. I mean, not a few, but the virgin birth and him being the man he was, who some say just a militant rabbi, but just a man, bro. And again, like I tell people, you're Hellenized, you're still Hellenized, and you're still within the Pauline Christianity if you believe within the messianic movement, and that he has a virgin birth, and that he's coming back to save you and all that, so that's just what it is. All right, it's nothing wrong with following him, but only person that can save us is the Father. So let's keep going, and Like I said, I had to get myself all the way out that Pauline doctrine. No matter what nobody say, humility is what it is. All right. At the time where Peter had already supposedly, all right. So we ripped that part. And then it says, apostolates, Christianity in Palestine developing in something of the manner of the Islamic Caliphate and Shiite Adat, that is the center of the family of Jesus. James is not only the key to a revelation and reconstruction of Jewish Christian history and the Jewish Christian relationships, he is also the key to the historical Yahshua. He is also the key to the historical or Jesus. The solution to this problem has evaded observers for so long, primarily because they have attempted to approach it through the eyes and religious legacy of James, arch rival and sometime religious enemy, Paul. It is though James, Jesus, spiritual heir. Next page, page 8. Spiritual heir, actual physical successor in Palestine, that we are the safest ground in the approaching a historical accurate resemblance of what Jesus himself, all right, and so far as he actually existed, might have been alike. Of all the characters in the early stages of Christianity, Paul alone is known to us through reliable, first-hand, autobiographical documents, that is, the letters attributed to him in the New Testament that reveal his life, character, and thought in the most personable manner possible. All others, even Jesus, and most of those generally called apostles, we only by second or third hand accounts, if we know them at all. We have gospels or letters, all right, purportedly written about them or in their names, but these must be handled with the utmost care. It is also not generally comprehended that this is a sequence which we should take the New Testament, Paul's letters, and a few other materials, possibly included the letter of James, come first and are primary. The rest come later and are secondary. The Gospels themselves are probably even tertiary. Biblical scholars have not come to the consensus on which aspects of this legacy can probably consider historical, nor have they succeeded in giving us, despite the bulk of their output, a very real picture of what might have been occurred at the formative moment in human history, or the events surrounding and succeeding the life of the individual in the Hellenistic world, the Christ. When it comes to the person of Jesus, brother James, however, we are on much firmer ground, not least because he has been marginalized and ignored. Yes, he has, throughout the whole history, even up to now. You know what I'm saying? Like, you heard of James, but you don't hear James like you heard Paul. Everything is about Paul, when it should be about, if anything, the successors and the people that came who Yahshua placed in power of him after his death, okay? Which should have been again James, and then again his last closest relative, Simon, all right, which is his brother. Let's keep going. And then it goes on to say, however, we're on a much firmer ground, not to least because he has been so marginalized and ignored. We have numbered of facts concerning James, life attested by a variety of independent observations within and without Christian traditions. It should not be surprising that the existence of an actual brother of Jesus in the flesh was a problem for the theologian committed to a priori doctrine of divine sonship or the supernatural birth of Jesus Christ. You see that? That's what I'm saying, okay? So one must understand that this whole Council of Nicaea, which is based off Pauline Christianity and a vision, was all based off Paul, okay? Which was all based off Paul and what he had. And we can actually second witness that. I'll go into one of my books real fast. All right. Again, which is my favorite ones. And I'll read it real quick. It's called the book of Jacob, all right, the pious. The book of Jacob the pious, son of Cleophas, all right, which is supposed to be James the Just. And what it says is the community there had been swelled by Greek followers from Cyprus who were most fervent in their mistaken belief that Yahshua had been the promised Messiah to Jewish people. In Antioch, under Paul's obdurate influence, the community came to believe that Yahshua as the Christ, that is, as the Messiah, died to save us all from our sins, Since, according to common Jewish beliefs, the promised Messiah was not supposed to get killed, Paul had to invent a way to explain and justify his death. He resolved the conundrum by falling back on the tales of the dying and resurrected gods of his youth. Okay, so understand, when one asks, well, why again? Paul's beliefs. One must go back to who was Paul. Again, like Robert Eisenman said, he never met Christ, never walked with Christ, never shook his hand, never smelt his breath. I added that last part. Okay, understand that. So, where did Paul come from? One cannot tell you that. Most Christians can't tell you where Paul came from. Okay, all right. What was his background? Most Christians can't tell you his background. All they're gonna tell you is God forgives them and that everybody is saved. What was his beliefs? Most Christians in the world can't tell you what his beliefs was, okay, but until before he came inside the picture. All they can so-called tell you was he was from the tribe of Benjamin, he was a Hebrew, and that he was a Pharisee. That's it. But one has never took the consider to actually really sit down and say, yo, but few, many few, I'm gonna say many few, not a lot, many few, and say, yo, what's up with this Paul character? And the fact that he has more epistles in the New Testament than the followers of Christ himself, and also his own bishop and leader of Jerusalem and elder who he answered to in Acts 15 and 21, James. That should be a problem. That should be a red flag and a red eye. Okay, let's keep going. Then it goes on to say, all right, it says, it should not be surprising, all right, that the existence of an actual brother of Jesus in the flesh was a problem for the theology committed to impure doctrine of divine sonship or the supernatural birth of Jesus Christ. Let me highlight that. That's actually a highlight. Since when study time, get my green marker on to keep that. Because again, like I said, I follow the Ebionite doctrine. I believe James was an Ebionite or Essene, so that's what it is. Then it says in Roman Catholic doctrine, it has been received teaching since the end of the 4th century that James was the brother of Jesus, not only a different father, an obvious necessity in view of the doctrine of divine sonship, but also by a different mother. The answer to the conundrum presented by the perpetual virginity of Mary, that is, James was a cousin of Jesus. You see that? So they try to make out James to be the cousin of Jesus. You feel me? Due to the doctrine of the so-called Virgin Mary. You see, when you call Mary a virgin, then you X out his whole brother and sister lineage that we've seen in Matthew chapter 13, verse 55. You feel me? So again, you got to watch it, man. It's idolizing. And I know it's a hard pill to swallow. It was a hard pill to swallow for me, but then again, it wasn't, because once I found James' doctrine and I knew what it was, I slapped it off. You feel what I'm saying? Sometimes I even got like little reflections of it, like it's like you say, it's like it's still welling up off me. Like, damn, this is something I've been believing so long. This is something I even taught, on Facebook. You know what I'm saying? But it's all part of growth and humility. But now we at where we at, and it is what it is. All praise. It says that is James was cousin of Jesus. This problem was already anticipated in the Gospels by the confusing proliferation of Marys, in turn related to confusion between Jesus' father Joseph and his uncle Cleophas, and the confusions between all the Simons, Judases, Jameses, and so on, to the extent that, as absurd, as it may seem, we finally end up with Mary, the sister of her own sister Mary, John chapter 19 and 25, called there the wife of Cleophas as well. Let's look at that. Here we are. It says in John 19 and 25, It says, now there stood by the cross Jesus, his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. 26 says, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he said to his mother, woman, behold thy son. So here it is. Let's read that again. Now there stood by the cross Jesus, his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. So again, like Rabbi Eisenman said, which is correct. All right. Like he said, the problem was already anticipated in the Gospels by confusing proliferations of Marys, in turn related to confusions between Jesus' father Joseph and his uncle Cleophas, and the confusions between all the Simons, Judases, Jameses, and so on, to the extent that, as it absurd may seem, we finally end up with Mary, the sister of her own sister, Mary, John 19:25, called there the wife of Cleophas as well. And it goes to say, we shall not dignify with a response attempts by church writers, earlier or late, to prove James and Jesus had different mothers, or depending on their theological positions, different fathers. We shall take these for what they are, embarrassments over the existence of Jesus, brother, and bids to protect the emerging doctrine of the supernatural Christ. You see that? That's what it does. The whole reason for John 19:25 and these doctrines, making brothers, brothers into cousins, cousins into brothers, and so forth, was to protect the supernatural doctrine of Christ. Point blank, period. That's the whole reason. To those that watch this now, watch this later, it may be a hard pill to swallow, but it is what it is. If you don't get it together, you will suffer. All right, all praise. These developing in the second and third centuries were totally absent. All right, but are totally absent from the contemporary documents relating to the family of Jesus that survived the redactions process of the New Testament. There is also sufficient evidence to show James as a normative Jew of the time, even referred to by the most extreme terminology, zealot or Sectarian. This in spite of his being the most important of the central triad of the early church leaders, whom Paul denotes as pillars. What a normative Jew might have been in these circumstances before the fall of the temple will require further elucidation. For the purpose of the discussion, we are on safe ground. However, if we say that such a concept at least encompasses an attachment to the law, whether from the perspective of the halakha on the Pharisees or a more pseudographic or apocalyptic perspective belonging to one of the other opposition groups, it also consists of the feeling for the temple and the temple worship, at least before its fall, regardless of attitude towards the Herodian pro-Roman priesthood overseeing it. At some point in the mid-40s, Cephas and John, two of those Paul designate as pillars in Galatians chapter 2 and 9. All right, let's look at that. Galatians 2 and 9. All right, there it is. Just giving y'all scriptures and second witness. Galatians chapter 2 and 9. Oh, yeah. All praise, sister. Gotta be reborn. Gotta be reborn. Let me tell you something, sis. See, it's very, the Old Testament brothers on point with this. They was on point with this, but we know what it is as far as they Levitical priesthood doctrine. We know what it is. You know what I'm saying? So we get those brother that they write upon that idolizing this Jesus character and the whole Paul thing, but we do know, other situation. All praises. Again, reborn. Like you say, this part of being reborn. And it's a blessing because, again, like only a few is going to be able to receive this. Only a few is going to be able to receive this. The fact that to people understand, like again, that Paul is the enemy of James, and when people finally search out James and his background and his true religious beliefs, they will finally see you have to compare James' beliefs to Paul. All right, so one has to ask, does James believe in the virgin birth? Does James believe in the messianic movement? Does he believe and the super and the supernatural Christ. You feel me? And a lot of, again, sis, a lot of it is ghost stories, point blank. You know, so and I'm feeling that's why it's hard. You know, it's hard because, you know, that's why I'm glad I got the actual scroll of James now, somewhat, you know, maybe more, but what I got, I'm glad, you know, and what I share with you, I'm glad. So, and that's what we gotta bounce off of. We got to get up off this Pauline juice. So Galatians 2:9, it says, when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, all right, you see that? And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given unto me, all right, they gave to me and Barnabas the right hands of fellowship, that we should go into the heathen and they into the circumcision. So again, you see that it says James, Peter, and John, all right, supposedly gave Barnabas and Paul fellowship. You feel me? They lied all this time. She said, exactly. I wasn't surprised. Yeah, they lied all this time. Yeah. And as you can see, it says James, Cephas, and John. James, Peter, and John supposedly gave Paul fellowship, okay, to go into the heathen. All right. So as we can see, the world didn't want to acknowledge James. They acknowledged Peter and John. Very, 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 very few. Because, you know, but they didn't acknowledge James. Point blank, period. All right, let's keep going. Where my mark? All right. And it says, where was we? I know it mentioned Galatians. Okay. Pillars. Then it goes on to say, what a normative Jew might have been in the circumstance before the fall of the temple require further elucidation. For the purpose of the discussion, we're on safe ground. However, if we say that such a concept, at least encompassing attachment of the law, whether from the perspective of the Helka of the Pharisees, all right, of a more pseudographic or apocalyptic perspective belonging, I'm trying to find the word. Okay, here we are. And it says, at some point in the mid-40s, Cephas, John, and two of those Paul designates as pillars in Galatians chapter 2 and 19, which we read. And it says, along with another, James. The brother of John, as distinct from James, the subject of this book, disappears, such as Agrippa, from the scene, probably in the context of conflict with the Herodian kings, such as Agrippa 1, 37 to 44 CE, of his brother Herod of Chalcis, 44 to 49 CE. Thus, James was left to occupy the Christian leadership stage in Palestine alone for the next 2 decades. At least is what can be gleaned from the materials in Acts. However, imprecise or mythological they may be, the direct appointment or election of James is the next one. All right, we're going on. We're on page 9. We're going to be heading on to page 10. So this one is called the direct appointment of election of James. He says, whether James succeeded to this leadership by direct appointment of Jesus, or he was accorded it by apostles or elected, is disputed in the sources. However he emerged, such a succession seems to have been connected with the sequence of the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to his disciples, as depicted in the literature, or Eusebius puts it during Clement of Alexandria, the order in which the tradition knowledges was accorded individual leaders. It says, there are lost resurrection traditions that accord precedence even in this to James, despite attempts to liberate them. One of these, found in the first post-resurrection appearance episode in the Gospel of Luke, depicts Jesus as appearing to Cleophas, that is Simon bore Cleophas, or his father, all right, together with another unnamed companion, possibly James, on the Emmaus Road outside of Jerusalem. A second is certainly to be found in 1 Corinthians 15 to 27, where Paul confirms his appearance to James, and last of all, himself. Let me see. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 15 and 15 and 7. All right, 1 Corinthians 15:7. It says, after that, we start at 6. After that, he was seen above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present. But some are fallen asleep. After that, he was seen of James, then of all the apostles. See that? Yeah. 1 Corinthians 15:7. You know, I've never heard none of this inside the church. I've never heard none of this. Never heard none of this. All right. Never heard none of this. It's just the name I say. I actually want to put the other one in there too. Yeah. The Most High truth had to come forth. Enough is enough. Ain't to last. Yeah, gotta come forth. Gotta come forth, Queen. Gotta come forth. Yeah, and it's sad. You know what's crazy is I listen to everything. You know the mark. You know I'm open to everything, and I ain't turning a blind eye. I heard people say the mark is the doctrine, the chip, all that. I believe it. I believe it. Like if you ain't in tune spiritually and to know exactly what's going on and to know the Father, that I believe the seal from the Father is that seal of Him knowing his children knowing Him. Like it's a special seal. Like they know the Father. Like listen here. Like I believe the mark is from the chip, the doctrine you obtain, what you worship, all that. Like you either got the mark of the Most High or you got the mark of Satan. You know what I'm saying? That's just what it is. Either the seed of Cain or the seed of Adam. Point blank, period. All right? So it's real out here, man. Let's keep on. Let's get to it. Let's get to it. All right. But at least we at where we at now. All praises. It says, where Paul confirms in his appearance to James, which is 1 Corinthians 15:7. It says in the former, at least, if not in the latter, we have unassailable evidence of the tradition according to precedents in the matter of the first appearance to a member or members of Yeshua's family, Clopas, according to the extant traditions, being at the very least, Jesus' uncle. Interestingly enough, this appearance takes place in the environs of Jerusalem, not in Galilee, as most other such gospel traditions. In addition, other early traditions reflected to a certain extent in the gospel. All right. All right. And the gospel of Thomas found at the Nag Hammadi, at the Pseudo-Clementine's Hellenistic romances, paralleling Acts, but from a Judeo-Christian point of view, actually speak in terms to a direct appointment of James by Jesus, as opposed to this early church traditions via Clement of Alexandria, 150 to 250-15. Reported by Eusebius, not insignificantly speak of an election of James or an election by the apostles. Whatever the conclusion, there can be no doubt that James was the actual successor in Palestine, if not elsewhere. Finally, there is the letter ascribed to James of the New Testament, which Eusebius considered spurious, despite its Jewish apocalyptic character, and in spite of its purportedly late appearance on the scene. It was evidently endued with such prestige that it could not be excluded from the canon. It can be shown to be a direct repostate to the points Paul make in his canon. In his letters to the Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians. Even if this is not sufficient to consider its authentic, its doctrines are enough, like those of the historical James, reconstructed from other sources, to contend that at the very least it represents authentic Palestinian traditions. Despite its relative polished Greek style, the antiquity of its material can also now be confirmed by reference to its many parallels to doctrine in the Dead Sea Scrolls, not available previously. It also lacks the Gnostic tendencies, so prevalent in the latter documents featuring the person of James. In it too, the temple would seem to be still standing, in the catastrophe that was soon to overwhelm the Jewish life in the Palestine has seemingly not yet occurred. At present, opinions concerning it show a greater flexibility, their willingness to come to grip with at least the possibility of its authenticity. Given its manifesting parallels with the documents from Qumran, all right, with which it makes an almost perfect fit and doctrines attributable to the person of James from their sources, it has to be considered a fairly good reflection, at least of the Jamesians' point of view. In fact, apart from the Pauline corpus and the we documents, on which, as well we see, the second part of Acts is based in a few wordsome phrases, such as the perfect law of freedom. And I believe this is James 1:25 and 2 and 12. Let's look at that. James chapter 1 and 25. There it is. James 1 and 25. But whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed indeed. I remember, according to Paul doctrines, we dead to the law. You don't need works. All you need is faith. Okay. So that's James chapter 1 and 25. Must be a doer of the law. Faith without works is dead. Let's copy. Let's put that in the comment section. All right. And let's go to James 2. All right. James 2. Oh. They won't let me on. They won't let me go on this. Next chapter. There it is. What do you say? James 2 and 12. So ye speak as they shall be judged by the law of liberty. There it is. So speak ye, and so do, as they that shall be judged by the law of liberty. All right. The liberty and justice for which it stands. All right. All praises. That's what I got going on, man. Like you said, reborn, sis, man. I done been whole reborn, man. I done started a whole different mission for myself, I know this is a hard pill for a lot of to swallow, but it is what it is. Like Brother Wallace said, man, what's for you is for you. You know what I'm saying? It's the road and mission we on. So we're on a new mission. Let's get it on. Where we at with it? We're on the next one. It says it is one of the most, all right, one of the most humongous, authentic, and possibly even earliest pieces in the New Testament corpus. At this point, one should also note that the letter of Jude, whose author refers to himself as the brother of James, is probably of the same order of the authenticity, and its tone echoes the letter of James. All right. I actually want to look at that. I think that's actually I think I seen that too. I want to see if it start off like that. There it is right there. Jude chapter 1 and 1. You see that? As you can see that in Jude chapter 1 and 1. Even Jude, see? So that actually goes in with Matthew chapter 15 and 55. Jude was one of the brothers of Christ. And then, as you see in the story, James is the brother of Christ and Jude is the brother of James, as it says. So this is Jude 1 and 1. Yeah. I'll put that in the comment thing. Yeah. Jude 1 and 1. Let's read that. Jude 1 and 1. Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ, the brother of James, to them that are sanctified by God, the Father, and preserved in Jesus Christ, and called. You see that? Jude 1 and 1. All right. So again, the letter of Jude. whose author refers to himself as the brother of James, is probably of the same order of the authenticity, and it echoes the letter of James. A parallel individual appears in the gospel apostle list, Judas of James, and he, a Jude, or probably identical with another apostle known in the apocryphal traditions as Judas Thomas, or Judas the twin. He is also probably referred to in somewhat, all right, to somewhat distorted, all right, and therefore probably a tendinacious manner in the Gospel of John and Didymus Thomas, literally twin, all right. In our discussion of Jesus' brothers as apostles, all those overlapping materials will be amalgamated to show that the same multiplication name encountered, it's big words, visivus, other members of Jesus' family is now being encountered with regard to this Jude as well, since he will also prove to be equivalent to several other characters having the same or similar names at the sources. The cast of characters will therefore narrow considerably. There are also two apocalypses attributed to James the Nag Comedy Corpses, as well as the additional riposte from James to Peter and the prelude to the version of the Pseudo-Clementine homilies, all right, known as the homilies. And the last there are also letters reputedly from Clement to James and Peter to James. All praise. We know that. We've seen that. And we read that, which actually which became a concern because James wasn't feeling some of the things that Peter was teaching. All right. It says there is also a gospel attributed to James, usually referred to as the infancy gospel or the proto-evangeline of James. I got those also too. Averring of all things the perpetual virginity of Mary. As will be seen, its author might more appropriately have applied this doctrine to James' lifestyle. Who else to give a better testimony to facts related to the infant Jesus than the person represented as being the older brother? But it is most certainly spurious. Finally, there was work which the writer Epiphanius, 367-404, a contemporary of Jerome, Augustine, claims to have seen, called the Anabathu Jocabu, or the Ascents of James. I have that also. No, I ain't got that. That's actually when I was actually planning on ordering. And I actually never got it. I actually did away with it. So I'm gonna actually put that back in my list, the Ascents of James. It's actually like a little blue book on Amazon. Yeah, the Ascents of James. After the lectures, James, pictured as delivering the Jerusalem masses from the temple steps, Epiphanius then gives quotations from this work, which further criticized James' role at the center of agitation at the temple, opposing the Herodian priesthood and decrying its pollution. This interesting text, who no longer exists, it was found, this perfectly holy and righteous just one in the temple, that in our view, all parties opposing the Herodian Roman establishment, from the more violent and extreme to the less one-raged establishment, from the more violent and extreme to the less so ranged, and this role as bishop, there it is, you know that, he was a bishop, and this role as bishops, James was also a high priest of the opposition alliance, thus in effect the opposition of high priests. This is the role according to him in the early church tradition as well, and as such it is more or less equivalent to the individual dubbed in Qumran usage, the Makaba, or overseer, or the high priest community, the many. This role is recorded to the teacher of righteousness at the Qumran. All right, so they give the teacher of righteousness title to James. Ultimately, we shall place James at the center of the opposition alliance of all the groups and parties opposing foreign rule in Palestine, and is concomitant foreign gifts and sacrifices on behalf of foreigners in the temples. The opposition of this alliance to Herodian kings and the Herodian priesthood led directly to the uprising against Rome. This forms of the mirror image of the way Christian tradition portrays the messianic individuals it approves of, who are pictured as sympathetic or at least not antipathetic to Rome. This kind of inversion will be shown to be a consistent aspect of the portraiture and the polemic of this period to rescue James from the obscurity in which he was cast. We should now turn into the history of the Palestine proceeding, which set the stage for his life, as well as to the description of those sources on which our information about him is based. All right. All praise. So that's pretty much that. And the next one will be the Second Temple and the rise. The Second Temple and the rise of the Maccabees. Okay. Just giving you a little we pretty much, like I say, Father willing, as long as I'm living, you know what I'm saying? Like I say, this is the James channel. So I'll be bringing a lot of James network and a lot of things up out of this book concerning James. And again, this book helps others understand scripture and what's going on, even to those that act like they know what's going on. But this may help others that don't know what's going on, include myself, that didn't know what was going on. So again, this is the James Network channel. That was just the first one. Hope y'all like that one. We're going to go ahead and pass on. Our praise to the heavenly creator. We get up out of here with a prayer and let it be done. Our Father, Mother, who are above and within, hallowed be thy name with the twofold Trinity and wisdom, love, and equity. Thy kingdom come to all. Thy will be done as in heaven, so on earth. Give us day by day to partake of thy holy bread and the fruit of thy living vine, as thou dost forgive us of our trespass, and we forgive others who trespass against us. Show upon us the goodness that to others we may show the same. And the hour of temptation, deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory from ages of ages, now ages of ages. Hallelujah. Say loud. All praises, everybody. I love y'all, man. Make sure y'all share this, get this out. All praises.